in the great stone castles of medieval Europe. Behind towering walls and iron-gated courtyards lived women whose lives were anything but free. To the outside world, they were queens and princesses draped in silks, their fingers heavy with jewels, their smiles composed, their posture elegant. Yet behind the layers of fine fabrics, beyond the gold-threaded tapestries and glimmering chandeliers, there existed an invisible prison, not of bars or shackles, but of expectation, of etiquette, of silence. Royal women, born into lives of grandeur, often found themselves quietly enclosed within what we might call gilded cages, beautiful on the outside, but suffocating within. A princess, perhaps no more than 16, wakes to the muted light of dawn slipping through a lattice window. The air in her chamber is cold, the stone walls retaining the night's chill. She hears the soft patter of servant feet outside, a faint rustle of fabric, a cautious knock. The day will be long, though it is filled with very little. She will sit by the window, stitching a rose onto linen that will never be worn by her. She will listen to her lady-in-waiting reading aloud from a book of sermons, the words floating gently in the air, more as background than meaning. There will be a walk in the inner courtyard, 20 measured steps from fountain to archway and back again, accompanied by watchful eyes. And then the long quiet of afternoon, where time feels slow and syrup-thick. The grandeur of the castle is deceiving. From afar, it stands tall, a symbol of strength and magnificence. But within its inner chambers, especially for the royal women, it becomes a labyrinth of isolation. These rooms are not designed for freedom. They are designed for display. A queen's. Solar, adorned with polished silver mirrors and rich tapestries, is a gallery. The world is invited to admire her grace, her beauty, her dignity. But no one is invited to know her. Once as a child, the princess might have wandered the castle freely, curious about the world outside the stone walls. But as she matured, as her body grew into the shape that made her valuable for political alliances, the doors quietly closed around her. Freedom became something delicate, something fragile, something dangerous. The more poised and composed she became, the fewer places she was allowed to go. It was not uncommon for royal women to spend entire days in the same room, the same chair, by the same window. Visitors were orchestrated, conversations rehearsed. Even moments of solitude were never truly private. There were always servants present, silent, attentive, watchful. Each movement, however small, was recorded in glances, reported in whispers. And so a royal woman learned to contain herself, to live within a stillness that was both expected and enforced. Pleasure in these chambers was a fleeting thing, a rare flower in the garden. Perhaps it was found in the soft texture of a new bolt of velvet or the faint aroma of lavender oil brushed into her hair. Perhaps it lingered for a moment in the delicate strings of a lute played softly in the evening as the sun sank behind the turrets. But these pleasures had to be quiet, understated, hidden beneath layers of duty and decorum. Anything louder, anything freer was unwelcome. A queen who laughed too much, who expressed her joys too openly, risked being seen as frivolous or worse, improper, and yet it was not just the walls of the castle that trapped her. It was the delicate web of expectations spun tightly around her life from the moment of birth. A royal woman existed not as an individual, but as a symbol. She was the promise of alliances, the potential mother of heirs, the living embodiment of grace and virtue. Her personal desires, her dreams, her interests, her small private joys were never the subject of courtly interest. They were seen as distractions, irrelevant to the grand narratives of dynasties and power. Outside, in the bustling markets beyond the castle walls, life moved with color and noise. Vendors shouted their wares, children played in muddy streets. Laughter echoed freely. But from her chamber window, the princess could only watch. She was permitted to see, but not to touch, to hear, but not to join. Even when she was allowed into public spaces, her role was performative. A royal procession, A formal audience, these were not moments of participation, but of display. Choose to be admired, not engaged. As days turned to weeks, and weeks to months. The isolation took on a peculiar weight. It was not the sharp, dramatic loneliness of exile, but a softer, more insidious quiet, a stillness that seeped into the bones. There were no locks on the doors, but each morning, when the soft click of the latch closed her in, it was understood. Her world remained within these walls. Her cage was lined with velvet, but a cage nonetheless. And so, in this quiet confinement, many royal women learned to retreat into their inner worlds. They found solace in small acts of creation, embroidery, music, the careful tending of a potted plant on a windowsill. They crafted tiny rebellions in the form of beautifully handwritten letters, folded discreetly and passed through trusted hands. These acts were not loud, not grand, but they were moments of self, moments of choice. However fleeting. Yet, the most significant transaction of her life had yet to come. Beyond these walls, fathers, uncles, and kings discussed treaties and alliances, each conversation narrowing the princess's future. She would be wed, not for love, but for land, for power, for peace. And when that day arrived, when the soft tightening of wedding laces signaled her entry into another gilded cage, the princess would be expected to leave behind not just her home, but her dreams of personal joy. Her life, traded in a marriage bargain, would soon become a public spectacle. The grand halls would fill with music and applause, but within her, the silent isolation would remain. As the light fades from her chamber, and the quiet settles into stone. She waits. For morning, for decisions made without her. For the next click of a door that opens not to freedom, but to another room. Another expectation. In the quiet hours before dawn, a princess awakens, not to the soft glow of morning light, but to the faint murmur of footsteps in the corridor. The castle stirs with preparations, but not for her comfort. Today is her wedding day. A day she has known was coming, not with excitement, but with the still, heavy acceptance that every royal daughter learns in time. Her marriage has been arranged for months, perhaps years. The contract drafted in candlelit chambers where kings and ministers spoke in low, practical voices. Her name mentioned not as a daughter or a woman, but as a seal, a signature. An alliance. This is the day her body becomes a treaty. In her chambers. The air is scented with lavender and beeswax, but beneath the delicate fragrances lies the unspoken tension of expectation. Attendants move around her with careful efficiency, bringing forth the wedding gown that has been stitched by dozens of hands, none of whom thought to ask her what she desired. The gown is beautiful, of course. Heavy brocade and soft gold, threaded with pearls, its weight pressing gently on her shoulders like a reminder of the crown she has yet to wear. Layers of silk rustle softly as they encase her form, each fold smoothing out the remnants of her girlhood, turning her into a bride suitable for display. The laces of her bodice are pulled tighter. The sensation is familiar. She has been corseted. Before molded into the ideal posture of a princess. But today, every knot, every loop, feels different, final. The tightening is not just around her waist, but around her future. She stands still, allowing others to dress her, adjust her veil, pin her hair. She is a canvas being prepared for presentation. Her own preferences, a silent, irrelevant detail. There is a soft hum of activity in the castle, yet within her, a hush. The man she is to marry is not a stranger entirely. She has seen him once, perhaps twice, during official audiences. He was polite, distant. His smile seemed rehearsed. But none of that matters. Whether he is kind or cruel, whether he notices her joys or disregards them, is not a concern of the court. What matters is the union. The lands it secures, the peace it promises, the heirs it will inevitably produce. A royal wedding is not a personal celebration. It is a public transaction. When she walks down the aisle of the great cathedral, flanked by towering columns and flickering candles, the gathered assembly will not wonder about her heart. They will admire the elegance of her gown, the precision of her curtsy, the symbolism of her dowry. They will speak of treaties strengthened, of bloodlines preserved. Their vows will be spoken in a language that sounds romantic, but is, in truth, bureaucratic. To have and to hold, yes, but she knows. These words bind her not in affection, but in duty. She is to hold the expectations of two dynasties now, to carry the burdens of lineage and alliance in every step, every glance, every breath. There will be music, of course, the delicate strains of a lute, the echoing harmonies of a choir, but beneath the melody, there is no joy swelling in her chest. There is only the rhythmic awareness of obligation. As she stands before the altar, her hand placed lightly into the grip of a man she barely knows. She feels the subtle shift within herself. This is not a moment of union. It is a moment of surrender. Not of her will, but of her right to choose. The court will celebrate. The bells will ring. But in the quiet of her mind, she retreats inward, to a place untouched by ceremony. God, it is important to understand that royal marriages in these medieval courts were never about personal pleasure. A queen's affections were considered a private indulgence, irrelevant at best, dangerous at worst. Her desires, if acknowledged at all, were seen as frivolous distractions from her true purpose. Pleasure was a currency that did not belong to her. After the ceremony, the feast will begin. Long tables adorned with silver platters, goblets brimming with dark red wine. Musicians will play, dancers will twirl in circles of choreographed joy. Guests will raise their cups and toasts that sound warm, but are, in fact, cold declarations. Of political satisfaction, she will sit at the high table beside her new husband, smiling as expected, her lips curved in the precise degree of contentment taught to her by etiquette tutors. She will sip from her goblet slowly, though the taste of wine is lost beneath the metallic edge of duty. The court poets may later write of her beauty that evening, of her serene demeanor, of the delicate way she held herself beside her husband. But they will not write of the quiet ache in her heart, nor of the way her thoughts drifted to a simpler joy, a walk in a garden, a song sung in private, pleasures that now seem distant, unreachable. A marriage bargain is not loud. It does not come with chains or public decrees. It is a slow, suffocating agreement, crafted in parchment and sealed with wax, designed to trade a woman's personal joys for the stability of a realm, and yet the subtlety of this transaction makes it no less cruel. A royal woman learns quickly that her body is not her own. It is a vessel for alliances, a canvas for the projection of political dreams. The pleasures of marriage, the intimacy of partnership, are privileges she may or may not be granted. They are not hers to claim. In the days that follow the wedding. The princess, now queen, will find herself in unfamiliar halls, surrounded by unfamiliar faces. She will be expected to navigate a new court, to embody grace and composure, while silently learning the undercurrents of power that swirl beneath every greeting, every glance. Her husband may seek her presence, or he may not. Either way, it will not change the expectation that she remains ever-pleasing. Ever-compliant. She will smile when addressed. She will nod in agreement. She will retreat into this sanctuary of silence, when her opinion is neither asked for nor desired. But court life is not always made of grand ceremonies. Sometimes the constraints are quieter, more personal. A queen may find herself admired, even idolized, through verses and paintings. And yet, this admiration often comes with a tightening grip. The more she is praised for her beauty, her virtue, her elegance, the less room she has to exist beyond these traits. Pleasure, if claimed too openly, becomes a liability. And so, a royal woman learns to guard her joys, to savor them in private, in the quiet spaces where eyes do not pry. A stolen moment with a favorite book, a fleeting smile shared with a trusted maid. These become her treasures, small and delicate, hidden beneath the weight of public expectation. The marriage bargain is not sealed in a single moment. It is a lifelong negotiation, a slow, unspoken trade of personal pleasure for political purpose. Tonight, As the festivities fade and the castle grows quiet once more, the new queen sits by her window. The moonlight drapes the stone walls in a soft glow. Outside, the world continues, indifferent to the exchange that has taken place within these halls. She exhales, slowly. She is not angry, not yet. She is simply resigned. Tomorrow, she will rise and play her role anew. She will greet. She will smile. She will endure. But beneath the surface, another performance awaits. A delicate dance of adoration without agency. The world of courtly love a stage where queens are praised in verses but never truly heard. And so, we will walk with her tomorrow, beneath the balconies where sonnets are sung, into the gentle contradiction of being adored but never free dot in the delicate hush of early morning. As sunlight filters through stained glass windows, the queen sits by her chamber's high balcony. The air is still, laced with the faintest scent of rosewater drifting up from the courtyard below. Soon there will be music. Soon the poets will gather, and the rituals of courtly adoration will begin. This, they say, is the age of chivalry. An era where noble knights compose sonnets to ladies fair, where troubadours sing beneath stone balconies, their voices rich with yearning. Queens and princesses are celebrated, immortalized in verses that travel across kingdoms. Yet for the women at the heart of these songs, the experience of being adored is not freedom. It is performance. Courtly love, as it is known, thrives on distance. It romanticizes longing, praises the virtue of unattainable women, and builds entire narratives on the idea that the object of affection must remain just out of reach. For the queen, this means being elevated to a pedestal so high that even her own voice becomes faint and ornamental. The troubadour arrives below her window, his lute cradled in his arms, his gaze respectfully lowered. He begins to play, a soft, lilting melody, each note rising into the air like a gentle request for her attention. The words are sweet, crafted to flatter, praising the golden threads of her hair, the serene curve of her smile, the delicate grace of her hands folded upon the balcony rail. She listens because it is expected. She smiles because it is polite. Yet, beneath the layers of silk and composure, a quiet truth lingers. This song is not for her. It is for the court, for appearances, for the delicate machinery of flattery and power that must continue turning. Courtly. Love has rules, strict and unyielding. The admirer must remain devoted, but never presumptuous. The lady must appear touched by his devotion, but never reciprocate. Their interaction is a dance, choreographed not by personal feeling, but by social expectation. In this ritual, the queen becomes less a woman, and more an ideal, pure, virtuous, untouchable dot in reality. However, she is entirely touchable claimed, in fact, by the political demands of marriage, motherhood, and courtly duty. The love celebrated in poems is a fiction, carefully maintained to keep her visible and yet inaccessible. She is adored in words, but controlled in life. It is a strange paradox to be worshipped and powerless in the same breath. The song ends, courtiers applaud. The queen inclines her head with practiced grace, acknowledging the troubadour's devotion. Without encouraging it, it is a delicate balance. To reject the poet's admiration too harshly would be ungracious. To embrace it too warmly would be scandalous. She must navigate the narrow path of being admired but never desired openly. Courtly. Love gave men the thrill of pursuit without risk, and for women it provided the illusion of agency and momentary elevation, only to be returned gently to their place within the carefully structured order of the court. Later, in the afternoon, there will be more performances. Perhaps a knight will dedicate his victory in a tournament to her. Perhaps a young scribe will present her with a poem sealed with a ribbon, his eyes full of rehearsed reverence. All of it will be lovely. All of it will be empty, because none of these acts grant her true agency. They are mirrors reflecting back an image of her designed by others, the queen's true opinions. Her real pleasures are never the subject of. These songs, no troubadour sings of her love for quiet mornings with a book, or her joy in tending to a small herb garden hidden within the castle walls. These personal joys are too mundane, too private, to fit the grand narrative of courtly romance. In public, she is a symbol. In private, she must keep her pleasures hidden, lest they be deemed improper. The irony is that the men who sing for her, write for her, kneel before her, do so to elevate their own status as much as hers. By composing verses of unattainable longing, they display their refinement, their restraint, their devotion. The queen becomes a necessary prop in their own performances of virtue. Their admiration is a reflection of their own courtly image. And still, she must smile. Still, she must respond with grace. It is exhausting. This constant act of being adored without being known. Sometimes in the stillness of evening, when the corridors fall silent and the glow of torches casts soft, flickering shadows upon the stone, the queen allows herself a rare thought. What would it be like to be loved not as a symbol, but as herself? Not for her lineage, her appearance, or her public composure, but for the quiet things that made her human? The way she hums absent-mindedly while stitching. The way she lingers in sunlit alcoves, lost in thought. But such musings are dangerous. To desire love beyond the courtly script is to risk impropriety. To reach beyond admiration is to invite censure. And so she folds these thoughts neatly away, tucks them into the same hidden drawer where so many of her small rebellions are kept, courtly. Love allows the appearance of romance without the risk of genuine connection. It is safe, controlled, yet, for the queen, it becomes another cage, this one built not of stone, but of sonnets. To the court, she is an inspiration. To herself, she is an echo. As days pass, the rituals repeat. Songs beneath balconies, dedications at feasts, poems left upon her writing desk. Each gesture delivered with reverence. Each gesture hollow in its careful distance. But there are moments, brief, almost imperceptible, when the queen finds subtle ways to reclaim herself. A slight deviation from the expected response. A glance that lingers a heartbeat longer than it should. A poem written in her own hand, hidden within the folds of her embroidery, where no courtly eye will see it. These are not grand acts of defiance. They are quiet, almost invisible. But in a life governed by performance, even the smallest act of genuine expression feels like a victory. The troubadours will continue to sing. The knights will continue to dedicate their triumphs. And the queen will continue to smile. Serene and untouchable, yet beneath that still surface, she will remain aware of the truth, that courtly love, as sweet as it seems, is another carefully woven web, a delicate trap of admiration without agency. Still, she endures. Tomorrow, the performance will change form. The adoration will remain, but the walls will close in tighter. For beyond the verses and the songs lies another layer of surveillance, the constant, quiet presence of attendants, of ladies in waiting who linger just a little too long, watching, listening, reporting. And so, as the day draws to a close and the soft sounds of the court fade into night, the queen prepares herself for yet another subtle imprisonment. The silent wardens who will follow her into every room, every thought. But that is a reflection for another day. For tonight. She rests beneath the weight of whispered sonnets, wondering what it might feel like to be loved without an audience. There is a peculiar kind of silence in a royal chamber. Not the silence of emptiness, but the muffled stillness of too many people pretending not to be present. A queen wakes to this silence, day after day, beneath the embroidered canopy of her bed. Around her, unseen but ever near, the watchful eyes of her attendants linger. They are always there, as much a part of her life as the stone walls and gilded. Mirrors. In the medieval court, privacy was not a luxury afforded to royal women. Every moment of a queen's life unfolded beneath the attentive gaze of others. There was no solitude in which to exhale freely, no quiet corner where she might let her composure slip. Her days began with observation, and they ended with it. Wrapped gently but firmly around her like an invisible veil, the queen's chambermaids arrive with the first light. Their footsteps soft against the cold flagstones, their hands folded neatly as they wait for her to stir. They bring with them the tools of daily preparation combs, brushes, silks, and laces, each one a gentle reminder that her body is not her own. Every strand of hair must be arranged, every fold of her gown perfected, not for herself, but for the court that watches through the eyes of her attendants. Their presence is outwardly benign. They smile as they work, they speak in soft tones, offering polite inquiries about her rest, her preferences for breakfast, her choice of jewels for the day. Yet beneath their courteous exterior lies a subtler function. These women are not only her servants, they are the court's informants, the king's ears, the nobility's whispers given flesh dot in medieval courts. A queen's attendants often reported to others, ladies, and waited observations to powerful families. Chambermaids who discreetly passed along details to ministers, even seemingly loyal confidants whose loyalty was carefully purchased by those with political interests. Their gaze was never truly neutral. The queen knows this. She has always known. This, from her earliest days in the palace, she was taught that every word spoken within the castle walls could find its way to unintended ears. She learned to filter her thoughts, to refine her expressions, to guard her tone. Even when alone in her chambers, she was never truly alone. As the attendants lace her bodice, their fingers moving with practiced precision, she feels the subtle tightening, not just of fabric, but of scrutiny. Every choice she makes is noted. A sigh, a lingering pause, a faint smile, each one a potential morsel for the court's ever-hungry appetite for gossip. She cannot laugh too loudly, lest she be deemed frivolous. She cannot appear too somber, lest rumors of melancholy or discontent begin to swirl. The balance is delicate. To exist as a queen is to perform a constant, careful neutrality, wrapped in silks and scented oils, even in the more private hours. Of her day, the watchful eyes do not waver. When she retires to her study, seeking a moment's peace among scrolls and books, an attendant lingers by the doorway, ostensibly to be of service, but in truth to ensure that no unsanctioned meetings occur, that no letters are written without oversight. A queen writing too much, too often, is a queen whose thoughts are deemed suspicious. When she walks through the castle gardens, the soft rustle of leaves and the gentle hum of bees cannot drown out the near constant presence of ladies in waiting, who stroll a polite distance behind, close enough to listen, far enough to maintain the illusion of privacy. She feels their eyes on her, subtle yet persistent, like a thread gently tugging at the edge of her thoughts. This surveillance is not harsh. It is not brutal. It is soft, methodical, inescapable. It does not seek to punish openly, but to prevent. Deviation quietly. Pleasure, in such a world, becomes an impossible thing. Spontaneity, sudden burst of laughter, a stray, unguarded comment. A moment of candid joy is suffocated beneath the weight of constant observation. To enjoy something freely is to risk it being misconstrued, whispered about, twisted into, a tool of political leverage. A queen who smiles too often becomes a subject of idle gossip. A queen who retreats too frequently is seen as cold, distant, and so she must craft a persona that is ever composed, ever appropriate, shaped meticulously. To avoid giving the court's many eyes any cause for comment, even the simple act of dressing becomes a negotiation. If her gown is too elaborate, it invites accusations of vanity. Too simple, and she risks being seen as neglecting the dignity of her station. Every jewel, every shade of fabric is a statement, and every statement is watched, weighed, and recorded. In whispers. There's a particular weariness that comes with being endlessly seen, but never truly known. The queen's attendants are not cruel. Many of them are women who, in their own way, are also trapped within the labyrinth of courtly expectation. They are pawns like her, their futures tied to delicate dance of service and discretion. Yet, the net they weave around her is less suffocating for its quiet, careful construction. On certain days, the queen allows herself a small rebellious thought. She imagines a world where she could simply walk alone, unaccompanied, free to breathe without an audience. She wonders what it would be like to feel the wind in her hair without a handmaiden rushing to smooth it back into place. But such thoughts are fleeting. They are luxuries she cannot afford. Instead, she masters the art of silence. Not the passive silence expected of her, but an active, knowing quietness. She learns to speak in glances, to convey her true thoughts in the arch of an eyebrow, the faintest lift of a shoulder. She discovers the power of choosing when to be still, when to let the watchful eyes find nothing of interest at night, when the castle slumbers and the corridors fall into shadow. There is a moment, a brief, fragile space where the queen is alone. The attendants have withdrawn, the gossip merchants have retired. In these rare hours, she can sit by the window, feel the cool stone beneath her palm, and exist without pretense. Yet, even in solitude, the habit of guardedness lingers. The walls have heard too many secrets. The tapestries have witnessed too many rehearsed smiles. She carries the watchfulness within her now, a quiet, internal vigilance that does not fade with the setting sun. The servant's gaze has become a constant companion, shaping the edges of her world, narrowing the paths she can walk, the joys she can claim. In this way, the medieval court does not need iron bars to imprison its queens. It requires only enough eyes, enough ears, enough soft footsteps lingering just out of sight. Tomorrow the rituals will repeat. The attendants will arrive with their silks and their smiles. The queen will stand serene and composed, while the court continues to watch through the ever-present veil of service. But within her, a quiet resistance flickers. A small, unspoken promise that somewhere amid the careful choreography of observation, she will find moments to breathe. To exist, to reclaim slivers of joy that no gaze can fully erase. The court believes it can shape her through silent surveillance, that it can contain her within layers of propriety and endless attention. But history is filled with quiet rebellions, and she will not be the first queen to weave small freedoms into the spaces between watchful eyes. Soon, however, another subtler form of control will come into focus. A queen's laughter, her joy, her lightness of spirit, these too will be policed. For in a world where pleasure is suspicion, even a smile can become an act of rebellion, but that reflection awaits another dawn. For now, the queen closes her eyes and lets the hush of stone corridors lull her into the soft, vigilant sleep of a woman always observed. In the hush of a medieval court, there are sounds that are welcome ritual words spoken with care. The rustle of silks as courtiers bow, the muted cadence of official announcements read aloud in chambers of stone. But there are other sounds, rarer, that ripple through these spaces with dangerous implication. Laughter, for instance, not the controlled, delicate smile hidden behind a fan. Not the polite, perfunctory chuckle offered at a nobleman's jest. But true laughter, unrestrained, sudden. A genuine spark of joy escaping into a room not meant for such things. For a royal woman. This was a subtle but potent rebellion. The queen remembers this lesson. Well, it was not taught in words. There was no formal decree against her amusement, but she learned it nonetheless, in the quiet way that courtly expectations teach through glances exchanged across a hall, through the careful stillness that settled whenever she laughed too loudly, too freely. She was young when it first happened. A slip of a moment at a courtly gathering, when a jester's clumsy tumble struck her with such unexpected mirth that laughter escaped her lips before she could contain it. It filled the hall bright, sudden, out of place. And as it echoed, she felt the room shift. Courtiers paused, their smiles stiff, their eyes politely averted but not blind. The jester, confused, bowed and continued his act. But the queen, she felt it immediately, that invisible tightening of the air, the unspoken disapproval hidden behind thin veneers of politeness. A queen's joy, when too visible, too unguarded, became unsettling, for in the rigid structures of medieval power, a royal woman's public demeanor was expected to embody composure, restraint, and grace. Excessive emotion, whether anger, sorrow, or laughter, was seen as a crack in the facade of regal decorum. Joy, especially, was dangerous. It suggested a freedom of spirit that did not fit neatly within the narrow walls of courtly expectations. A queen who laughed too openly was a queen who appeared frivolous, unserious, perhaps even indulgent. If her smile came too easily, rumors might whisper that she cared too little for the solemn responsibilities of her station. Worse still, if her laughter was seen as too charming, too captivating, it might stir jealous tongues, whispering of vanity, flirtation, or impropriety. Thus, over time, the queen learned the art of quiet amusement. She mastered the controlled smile, the barely audible chuckle, the slight tilt of the head that suggested mirth without betraying excess. She learned to tuck her joy behind the lace edge of a handkerchief, to fold it neatly beneath layers of etiquette and measured glances. Yet, the hunger for laughter remained. Joy is not so easily extinguished. It finds places to grow in the smallest cracks of routine, in the rare moments when vigilance falters sometimes, in the privacy of her chambers. Away from the ever-watchful eyes, she would allow herself the luxury of real amusement. In the company of trusted ladies, or perhaps alone, reading a particularly witty passage from an illuminated manuscript, her laughter would rise, soft but true, filling the room with a warmth that felt almost subversive. But the court's reach extended even into those moments. Attendants lingered beyond doors. Courtiers speculated over the faintest sounds. A queen's private mirth could become public knowledge in the time. It took a chambermaid to walk the length of a corridor. There were times when even the subtlest expression of joy became a political statement. A queen laughing at the wrong moment just made it a nobleman's expense. A poorly timed chuckle during a solemn feast could ignite murmurs of disrespect or impropriety. Laughter was not neutral. It was interpreted, dissected, woven into the court's endless tapestry of meaning. Thus, pleasure became a careful performance. Every smile, every light-hearted comment, every instance of visible joy had to be weighed against potential repercussions. Could it be misconstrued? Would it offend? Would it diminish the carefully crafted image of regal dignity? Even in court entertainments designed for amusement, a queen's role was to enjoy herself within boundaries. She could applaud the jester, not appreciatively at a minstrel's jest, but her own laughter had to remain soft, elegant, contained. It was a symbol, not a sensation, yet there were women who, knowingly or not, challenged these constraints. Queens and noble women who allowed their joy to slip beyond the court's expectations, if only for a moment. Their laughter, however brief, became acts of quiet defiance. Such moments did not go unnoticed. A queen known for her wit, for her sharp, playful tongue, often found herself walking a narrow line between charm and censure. Admired in public, yet whispered about in private, the very thing that made her beloved, her lightness, her spirit could, at a whim, be turned against her. Framed as evidence of vanity, distraction, or even seduction. History remembers these women unevenly. Some are immortalized as enchanting, others as frivolous, still others as dangerous. But the common thread is that their joy, their laughter, was never allowed to be simple. It was politicized, moralized, made into a measure of their worth or their downfall. And yet the queen wonders in the quiet of her chambers why joy should be such a radical thing. Why should the simple pleasure of laughter be seen as rebellion? Why must happiness in its purest, most human form be filtered through layers of expectation and judgment? As she reflects, she realizes that it is because joy, true joy, cannot be controlled. It cannot be measured or scripted or confined within courtly etiquette. And in a world where control is paramount, this makes joy a quiet, persistent threat. Still, joy finds a way. In the stolen glances exchanged between friends. In the soft giggles shared beneath the pretense of reading aloud. In the rare, precious moments when the walls of surveillance seem to fade, if only briefly, laughter becomes a language of resistance. A way to assert presence in a world determined to mold women to silent symbols. And so the queen learns to. Wield her joy with care. She allows herself to smile, to laugh, but in ways that slip beneath the radar of scrutiny. A shared joke whispered behind a fan. A playful comment delivered with just enough grace to be deemed harmless. These small acts become her rebellion, her way of existing fully within the constraints placed upon her. The court may not approve of her laughter, but it cannot erase it entirely, for within every restrained chuckle, every stifled giggle, there lies a quiet assertion of self. Tomorrow, the expectations will tighten once more. The lessons of propriety will continue, drilling into every gesture, every breath, until even the smallest movement becomes a reflection of courtly control. The queen's life will continue to unfold upon a script not her own, a script written in the language of etiquette. But even within that, there is space narrow, fleeting, but real for joy. For now, as the sun dips beyond the stone battlements, and the castle is bathed in the soft glow of twilight, the queen allows herself one last quiet laugh. It echoes softly against the cold walls, a small, defiant song of Azale. As she prepares for the next day, she knows the next layer of constraint awaits, the relentless lessons of etiquette. The endless drilling of how to stand, sit, speak, and breathe as the perfect queen. But that is a reflection for another night. For tonight, she rests beneath the gentle hush of her chambers. With a smile that no court can fully extinguish, in the grand halls of medieval castles where banners hung like heavy sighs, and the air was thick with centuries of expectations. Every movement a royal woman made was a performance, not an artistic expression, nor a display of self, but a ritual carefully rehearsed, endlessly scrutinized, and quietly enforced. A queen's life was scripted long before she ever spoke her first words. From the moment she could walk, she was taught that her body was a vessel of representation. Every gesture, every glance, every fold of her gown had to align with the silent, invisible laws of courtly etiquette. How to curtsy, how to stand with just the right tilt of the head, how to extend her hand in greeting without seeming too forward, yet never too aloof. It was a choreography of subtlety, an endless ballet performed beneath the watchful eyes of the court. Each morning, as the queen dressed, the lessons began anew. Her attendants would drape her in layers of fabric-rich velvets, silks that whispered with every movement, jewels that caught the light like polished judgment. Yet these were not merely garments. They were instruments of control, shaping her posture, dictating how she could sit, how she could walk. A tightly laced bodice ensured her back remained perfectly straight. A heavy mantle over her shoulders discouraged any casual slouching. Even her breath was not her own. Etiquette tutors, with calm voices and patient smiles, would remind her to breathe shallowly, to avoid the unseemly rise and fall of her chest in public. A queen was to be an image of serenity, unflustered, composed, distant from the vulgarity of earthly needs. The lessons were endless. Day after day. She would practice how to lower herself into a chair without appearing to sit, how to pick up a quill as though it weighed nothing, how to incline her head just enough to acknowledgement, yet not so much as to suggest subservience. Every movement was dissected, corrected, refined. A misstep was not merely a personal error, it was a failure of representation, a crack in the delicate image of regal perfection that the court demanded. And yet, these lessons were not taught with harshness. There were no raised voices, no overt punishments. The discipline was gentler, quieter, a disapproving glance from a tutor, a whispered correction from a lady in waiting, a subtle tightening of the atmosphere in the room. The queen learned to internalize these cues, to correct herself before correction was given. Over time, the script became second nature, but within her, there lingered a question. What would it feel like to move freely? To walk with unmeasured steps? To sit with comfort rather than grace? To gesture without calculating how it might be received? Such thoughts, though, were luxuries. In the medieval court, a queen's body was never simply hers. It was a canvas upon which the kingdom's ideals were painted. Etiquette extended beyond the physical. Even her words were bound by its invisible threads. She was taught to speak in phrases that curved gently, never abrupt, never too loud. Her voice was to be a soft melody, pleasing, deferential, yet never so assertive as to eclipse the voices. Of Mendat, questions had to be phrased carefully, suggestions offered as humble musings rather than opinions. A queen who spoke too directly was seen as bold. Boldness, in turn, was interpreted as arrogance, or worse, a challenge to male authority. Thus, she learned to master the art of saying much while appearing to say little. Even silence was a lesson. She was taught when to speak, when to listen, and when to simply smile and let the conversation wash over her. A queen's silence, when properly wielded, could be as potent as a speech. But even silence had rules. She could not appear disinterested nor too eager. It was a balance of attentive detachment, a stillness that had to be performed as meticulously as any spoken word. The court praised grace above all else. But grace, for a royal woman, was not an innate quality. It was labor practice honed and enforced through endless repetition. Every public appearance became a quiet test at banquets. She had to manage the art of eating as though she did not need to eat. Small, delicate portions, consumed with elegant restraint. She could not lean forward to reach for a dish. It had to be offered to her or not taken at all. Even drinking was an act of poise, no noisy sips, no visible thirst at ceremonies. Her posture had to remain impeccable for hours. No shifting of weight, no leaning on a nearby pillar, no expression of discomfort. The court watched for signs of weakness, even if masked in concern. A momentary lapse in composure could spark rumors. Is the queen ill? Is she discontented? Is she failing in her duties? These were the invisible chains of etiquette. They did not imprison with force, but with expectation. They did not bruise the body, but they weighed upon it, shaping it until the woman beneath became secondary to the role she performed. Yet, within these constraints, the queen found her own quiet form of control. She learned that by mastering the script, she could, at times, subtly rewrite it. A glance held a moment longer than expected could convey disapproval without a single word. A calculated pause in conversation could shift its direction. The very rules designed to confine her became tools in her hands, a language of gestures and expressions that allowed her to navigate the treacherous currents of courtly life. Still, the weight of constant performance was exhausting in the rear. Privacy of her chambers, away from the ceremonial gaze, she would allow herself moments of unguarded movement. She would remove the layers of etiquette as she unfastened her gown, let her shoulders slump, stretch her arms, breathe deeply. These small acts, so ordinary, yet so forbidden in public, became her refuge. There were times, in these quiet hours, when she would remember her childhood before the court had claimed her, when she could run through meadows without worrying about how her gait appeared, when her laughter did not need to be measured, but that life had been left behind, folded into the seams of her gowns, hidden beneath the layers of decorum. Yet, even now, a fragment of that freedom lived within her. Every now and then, at a formal gathering, she would allow herself a small deviation, perhaps an extra step in a walk, an unscripted tilt of the head, a genuine smile that warmed her entire face rather than the polite curve of lips expected of her. Small, almost imperceptible acts, but to her, they were victories, for the court could script her movements, her words, even her breath, but it could not reach the quiet corners of her will. And so, each day, she performed, not out of submission, but out of necessity. Yet within the confines of that performance, she continued to seek slivers of selfhood. Her life may be choreographed, but her thoughts, her quiet reflections, remained her own. Soon, however, she knew that this control would extend further still. For royal women who refused to conform fully, the path often led to quiet exile confinement. Not in chains, but in stone-walled convents where silence was enforced not by etiquette, but by isolation. But that is a reflection for another night. For now. The queen sits in her chamber, the day's performance complete, and breathes freely in the hush of her own presence. The stones of the convent are older than memory. They rise from the earth, like cold witnesses, their gray faces worn smooth by centuries of whispered prayers and unshed tears. Here, in the quiet, exiled of monastic life, many royal women found themselves draped not in the silks of court, but in the coarse simplicity of a nun's habit. Yet, this was not always a path chosen. More often, it was a path arranged, a quiet solution for women who had, in one way or another, stepped beyond the boundaries set for them. Exile to a convent was never declared as punishment. It was cloaked in noble phrases, an act of piety, a retreat into spiritual reflection, a voluntary withdrawal from the distractions of worldly life. But beneath these gracious words lay a more complex truth. For many royal women, the convent was the final chapter of a struggle that had begun with birth. The struggle to exist within a society that offered them grandeur but not freedom, attention but not agency. Their decision was rarely theirs, sometimes. A princess who had laughed too freely, questioned too boldly, or refused a marriage alliance found herself gently steered towards a life of devotion. Other times, a widow whose usefulness in the marriage market had waned was encouraged to seek peace behind convent walls. And there were those whose mere presence at court became inconvenient political pawns turned liabilities, sent away under the guise of religious retreat. The transition was soft, almost ceremonial, a formal procession to the convent gates. Words of blessing, faces composed into serene masks of approval. The royal woman would step down from her carriage, her fine shoes striking the stone path with a sound that seemed to echo finality. Behind her, the court would return to its business. Ahead, the heavy wooden doors of the convent would close with a gentle, irrevocable click. Inside, the world was slower. The air carried a different weight, filled not with the sharpness of court, intrigue, but with the cold, clean emptiness of seclusion. The queen, no longer addressed as such, would be led through stone corridors, where the only sound was the soft shuffle of veiled sisters moving from chapel to cloister. Here, pleasure had no place. Gone were the sumptuous feasts, the rich fabrics, the delicate laces. The queen's fingers, once adorned with rings, now brushed against the coarse wool of her habit. Her hair, once a symbol of beauty and power, was hidden beneath layers of linen. The mirror, once a daily confidant, was replaced by a plain crucifix hanging above a simple bed. Yet, the greatest deprivation was not material. It was human. The court had been a place of suffocating observation, but it was also filled with voices, with the subtle music of life's movements. In the convent, silence became the queen's constant companion. Conversations were hushed, laughter rare. Time unfolded slowly, measured by the tolling of bells and the monotony of ritual. And yet, in this exile, a paradox emerged, stripped of the court's expectations. The queen found a strange, fragile kind of freedom, no longer required to perform the endless scripts of etiquette. She could, if she chose, simply be. She could walk through the convent gardens without needing to consider how each step appeared. She could sit in the cloister and let her thoughts drift without fear of scrutiny. But freedom, in such a confined space, was bittersweet. The world outside continued to turn indifferent to her absence. Her name, once spoken in the great halls of power, was now little more than a fading footnote in the scribes' ledgers. The court would remember her with polite phrases, perhaps an occasional mention in prayer, but her influence, her presence, would slowly dissolve into the silence of these stone walls. The queen often wondered if this was the true purpose of such exiles, not to punish with cruelty, but to erase with gentleness, a quiet, effective way to remove a woman from the delicate balance of power without scandal, without outcry. The convent became a velvet-lined oubliette, a place where unwanted queens and princesses could fade from history with grace. Yet, not all faded. Some women in the solitude of convent discovered new forms of expression. They illuminated manuscripts, devotional poetry, letters that traveled beyond the walls with careful discretion. They tended gardens, not as an idle pastime, but as acts of creation, nurturing life in a space designed to suppress it. They taught younger novices, passing on knowledge and stories that might otherwise have been lost. In these small acts, the queen found fragments of herself. She took comfort in the rustle of parchment beneath her fingers, in the earthy scent of herbs crushed between her palms. The court had denied her a voice, but here, in these quiet tasks, she reclaimed it softly, slowly, but even these quiet pleasures were watched. Convent life, though cloistered, was not free from hierarchy. Abbesses, often from noble lineages themselves, ensured that discipline remained intact. A queen who sought too much autonomy, even in exile, could find herself reminded of her new place. Her past titles held no power here. Humility was the virtue expected, obedience the standard demanded. Yet, beneath the surface, there was a silent understanding. Many of these royal exiles shared a common story, women who had lived under the heavy expectations of court, who had been used as alliances silenced as liabilities. In their shared confinement, a quiet sisterhood formed. They did not need to speak aloud the reasons for their presence. It was enough to walk together in the cloister, to exchange knowing glances beneath the veiled dot in the cold evenings. When the stone walls seemed to press in closer, the queen would sit by the narrow window of her cell. Beyond the iron lattice, the world stretched wide and unreachable. Yet, within she traced the small freedom she still possessed. The act of reflection, of thought, was one no decree could take from her. She understood now that exile was not merely a place. It was a condition of being. At court, she had been surrounded by people, yet isolated by duty. Here, she was physically confined, yet in her mind she wandered further than ever before. Time in the convent was slow, recursive. Seasons bled into one another with little distinction, marked only by the shifting light in the cloister, the changing scent of the garden. The queen learned to read the sky with a quiet intimacy, to find beauty in the simplicity of a dew-laden rose, in the echo of her footsteps on the flagstone floor. Years would pass in a suspended existence. For some, it was a life sentence. For others, a temporary retreat, until the court found a new use for them. But the lessons of the convent were indelible. A royal woman who returned to court after exile was never quite the same. She carried with her the stillness of those cloistered walls, the weight of long silences. She knew, perhaps more keenly than ever, how fragile her place in history truly was. But here, tonight, she remains behind these ancient walls, breathing. In the quiet, letting the cold stone cradle her thoughts. Outside, the world forgets. But within, she remembers Dot and tomorrow. As the morning bells toll once more, she will rise, don her habit, and step into another day of quiet resistance. For now, she sleeps, cradled by the silence. But soon, the murmurs of blame will return, the soft, relentless whispers that fault queens for the failings of kings, for the weaknesses of courts, for the burdens of a throne. But that is a reflection for another night. Dot in the grand halls of medieval courts, where power was as fragile as the stained glass windows filtering pale light across stone floors. Queens walked a delicate path. They were crowned with splendor, adorned with jewels that shimmered like the promises of dynasties. Yet beneath the weight of their golden circlets lay a truth rarely spoken. When kings faltered, when realms fractured, when the careful balance of alliances teetered, the whispers rarely began with the king's name. They began with hers. A queen's laughter, a queen's gown, a queen's private indulgence small. Personal acts became the subtle seeds of blame when things went wrong. The court, ever in search of an explanation, found in her an easy symbol. Her pleasure was dangerous. Her joy was irresponsible. Her presence, when too vibrant, became a silent accusation that it did not matter whether she wielded real power. The mere perception of influence was enough. Imagine, for a moment, a queen seated beside her king during a tense council meeting. The room is filled with nobles, men of rank, their words heavy with veiled threats and cautious loyalty. The queen's presence is ceremonial, her voice unnecessary. Yet, if she shifts in her seat, if her bracelets softly clink together as she Adjust her sleeve, eyes will turn. A subtle arch of her brow. An exchanged glance with a favored courtier. These were noted, recorded, and retold beyond the council chamber. When a treaty failed or a noble's rebellion sparked, there were always those ready to suggest that the queen's influence had distracted the king, that her pleasures, be they silken gowns or courtly feasts, had led him astray from matters of state. It was a quiet accusation, rarely spoken outright, but in the murmured conversations by the hearths, in the soft exchanges between scribes, and the glances exchanged across banquet halls, the blame settled upon her shoulders like an invisible mantle. She bore it in silence. There was no place for protest. A queen who defended herself too boldly was said to lack humility. One who ignored the rumors was accused of arrogance. It was a careful, balancing act to appear concerned yet unbothered, dignified yet unaffected, yet the consequences were. Real court poets who once sang of her beauty and grace would begin to compose verses that hinted at vanity, frivolity, indulgence. Chronicles would record, in the most neutral tones, that under her influence the court became more lavish, while the treasury suffered. A simple note, but its implications were deep, even when the king's own decisions had led to military failure or economic strain. It was the queen's unsuitable counsel that was quietly blamed. Sometimes the accusations went further. A queen who was loved too openly became a distraction. A queen whose beauty turned too many heads was a temptress. There were courts where queens were blamed for the very wars their husbands had waged, under the suggestion that they had swayed the king's judgment through personal desires. The idea of a king acting of his own folly was unthinkable. It was easier, safer, to blame the queen's subtle seductions. This was not allowed. Public condemnation, it was a slow erosion of reputation. Over time, the queen would notice invitations to private councils becoming fewer. Allies at court would offer polite yet distant smiles. The lavish gowns she once wore with pride became subjects of hushed critique. Is such extravagance fitting in times of political strain? They would murmur. Each comment a thread, pulled gently, until the fabric of her influence began to unravel. Even motherhood, her sacred duty, could not shield her. If sons were not born swiftly enough, if heirs were sickly, the queen's health, her conduct, even her piety would be questioned. Superstitions took root. Was she cursed? Was she being punished for her vanity? Was God displeased with her enjoyment of worldly pleasures? In royal courts, guilt was seldom a matter of evidence. It was a matter of perception. And the queen, bound by the decorum of her position, could do little but endure. There were queens who attempted to reclaim their narratives through acts of visible piety founding convents, commissioning religious manuscripts, participating in acts of charity. These were calculated efforts to reshape public perception, to wash away the lingering stains of blame. But the court's memory was fickle. A single misplaced smile at a lavish feast could undo months of careful humility. And yet, the paradox remained. The queen was expected to embody grace and splendor, to enhance the court's image, to charm ambassadors and inspire poets. But when that very splendor outshone the king's success, it became her fault. Her pleasures, once celebrated, were turned against her. It was a delicate, invisible punishment, no formal charges, no grand accusations, but a steady undercurrent of suspicion that dulled her presence at court. In her private chambers, she would hear the echoes of these murmurs, the rustle of gossip slipping beneath doors, the subtle shifts in her ladies-in-waiting's tones. She would sit by her window, the light glinting off jewels now deemed excessive, and reflect on how easily admiration had soured into resentment. And yet, through it all, she maintained her composure. To show distress was to confirm the whispers. So she wore her smile like a veil, concealing the quiet calculations behind her eyes. She learned to navigate these shifting sands of perception with careful steps, reducing her presence just enough to dampen suspicion. Yet not so much as to seem defeated. In this quiet resistance, there was a certain power, for the queen understood. that courtly blame was a cycle. Today, her pleasures were the subject of critique. Tomorrow, another would bear the burden. And in that knowledge, she found solace. But the pattern persisted. Throughout medieval Europe, the pattern repeated itself in countless courts in endless variations. Queens who sang too sweetly, who dressed too finely, who dared to enjoy life amidst the heavy robes of duty, were quietly marked out not through decree, but through social breath, a collective inhalation of doubt, an exhale of blame, and yet in their private sanctuaries, be it a garden, a library, or a quiet alcove by the window, these women carved out moments of silent defiance. A sip of spiced wine, a handwritten verse, a stolen moment of laughter shared with a trusted friend. These small acts became their quiet rebellions. For the court could accuse, could whisper, could quietly diminish a queen's image, but it could not erase her capacity for joy. Even beneath the soft weight of unjust blame, she found ways to smile. Tomorrow, perhaps, the court's attention would shift, and another queen's pleasures would be questioned. But tonight, in the solitude of her chamber, she is herself no title. No accusations, simply a woman remembering that joy is a quiet form of courage. And soon, the murmurs will turn from personal pleasures to the very image of beauty itself, when admiration for a queen's appearance transforms into suspicion, and loveliness becomes a subtle, sharpened weapon against her. But that is a reflection for another night dot in the stillness of her chamber. A queen sits beneath a narrow window, sunlight filtering through delicate tracery, casting patterns of light across the vellum pages before her. The court outside is restless nobles arguing. Alliances shifting, but within these walls, there is only the quiet turning of pages. A small rebellion hidden in plain sight. For in the medieval world, books were more than repositories of knowledge. They were gates to freedom, and for royal women, whose every movement was observed, whose pleasures were scrutinized, the simple act of reading became an exquisite, silent form of resistance. It was a pleasure that did not shimmer with jewels or provoke scandal in the feast hall. It unfolded slowly, privately, in the flickering light of candles, in the quiet moments between ceremonies, when a queen could retreat to her chambers and surround herself with parchment and ink. Yet even this gentle indulgence was not without its dangers. A woman who read too much was curious. A woman who asked questions was impertinent. And a woman who wrote her thoughts, who dared to ink her reflections into permanence, risked being seen as overstepping the invisible boundaries drawn for her. But queens persisted. Within the courts, labyrinth of etiquette and expectations, there were alcoves of solitude, tiny sanctuaries where scrolls and codices waited, their spines cracked from secret handling. A queen would settle into a carved wooden chair, silken skirts softly folding around her, and let the outside world blur into the margins of her thoughts in these pages. She met voices beyond the constraints of her life. Ancient philosophers, chroniclers, poets whose verses dared to dream beyond duty. These books did not judge her for her pleasures. They did not caution her to smile less, to speak softer, to desire less. They offered her something court could not. A space to think freely. Imagine her tracing the delicate lettering of an illuminated manuscript. Each letter a small work of art. The colors deep azure, shimmering gold. Soft vermilion spoke louder than the courtiers who flattered her insincerely. Here, in ink and pigment, was a conversation untouched by gossip. For some royal women, these stolen hours with books became the only place where pleasure was not punished. Yet, even this quiet act was layered with politics. Access to books, to learning, was controlled. The libraries were guarded spaces, and though queens might commission manuscripts, they were not always encouraged to engage deeply with them. A queen fluent in Latin, a queen who understood the complexities of governance, was a queen to be watched. There were kings who preferred their queens silent and ornamental, who considered intellectual curiosity a trait better suited to monks and scribes. But there were also queens who learned to cloak their intelligence beneath a veil of delicate indifference, smiling softly. Even as their minds devoured histories and strategies and in these quiet readings, knowledge became an armor. For a queen, understanding the intricacies of lineage, of diplomacy, of legal precedent, became a subtle shield against the court's shifting tides. She could not openly command armies or draft policies, but she could advise with careful phrasing, slipping insights into conversations beneath layers of courtly decorum. Still, her pleasure in books was not always strategic. There were evenings when the weight of duty pressed too heavily, when the gossiping murmurs of the court became too loud, and she would retreat not to plot or strategize, but simply to read for the sake of beauty. A poem about a distant meadow, a legend of heroic Queen long past, a treatise on the stars. Their movements, a reminder that life extended far beyond the stone walls that encased her Dot in these moments. The queen was not a political figure, not a vessel for alliances, not a subject of courtly critique. He was simply a woman delighting in the texture of words, in the rhythm of ideas unfolding softly beneath her fingertips. Yet, the court noticed it always noticed. A queen who spent too much time in her library was whispered about. She neglects her duties, they would murmur. She fills her head with dangerous ideas. The same courtiers who had once praised her refinement now raised eyebrows at her scholarly distractions. Even the choice of books could become a point of contention. Religious texts were acceptable, even encouraged. But philosophical debates, histories of powerful queens, or tales that celebrated personal agency, these were deemed less appropriate. A queen who read about women who ruled in their own right might begin to imagine possibilities unfit for her station. And so, reading became a quiet act of defiance, not with speeches or protests, but with the simple, deliberate turning of a page. Each chapter read was a space claimed. Each idea understood was a wall, however small, against the erosion of her selfhood. Some queens went further. They wrote in secret journals. They poured their reflections, soft, measured sentences, crafted, in the dim light of dawn before the court stirred. Their words were not meant for public declaration, but for preservation, a way to anchor their identities amidst the tides of courtly expectation. In the margins of their books, they scribbled notes, observations about politics disguised as contemplations on scripture, questions about lineage couched within reflections. On morality, these hidden annotations were conversations with themselves, fragments of autonomy no etiquette tutor could erase. The act of writing, of putting ink to parchment, was a profound declaration. I am here, I am thinking, I am more than. A symbol. Yet, the danger was real. Manuscripts could be found. Private journals, if discovered, could be twisted into accusations. A queen whose private thoughts seemed too bold risked being branded as ambitious, a dangerous label for a woman whose role was to support, never to lead. And so, the pleasure of books was a balancing act. It was a sanctuary that required constant vigilance. A queen learned which texts to display openly, which to hide beneath layers of folded gowns in her chest. She learned to smile with polite indifference when questioned about her readings, to feign amusement at jokes about women dabbling in scholarship. But within, she knew the truth. These books were not idle distractions. They were lifelines. They reminded her that beneath the layers of silk, beneath the expectations of motherhood and queenship, she possessed a mind-curious, sharp, capable in the quiet of her library. Amidst the gentle scent of parchment and ink, she found a pleasure untouched by court's judgments. She understood that knowledge, once gained, could not be taken away. No whispered scandal could erase the lines of poetry she had memorized. No forced marriage could unteach her the chronicles she had studied. No exile could strip her of the reflections she had penned in secret. And so, each evening, when the feast hall's echoes faded and the corridors emptied, she returned to her books. The flicker of candlelight danced across illuminated margins as she read. It was a small act, a quiet joy. But in a world where her pleasures were monitored, where laughter was regulated, and beauty scrutinized, this small joy was a rebellion of its own. Soon, however, even her appearance, the way her beauty was seen, praised, and then quietly turned against her, would become the next subtle weapon of courtly control. But That is a reflection for another night. In the cold dawn light. A queen sits before her mirror. Not the kind of mirror we know today, but a polished disc of silver, its surface softened with age, reflecting her face in a blurred shimmer. Around her, the quiet ritual of dressing unfolds, the gentle brush of comb through hair, the slow fastening of a jeweled clasp, the rustle of fine linen as her attendants lace her bodice with careful hands. Her beauty, once a source of admiration, has become something else. It is no longer a simple attribute. It is a weapon, but not one she controls. In the medieval court, beauty was a double-edged thing. A queen was expected to embody grace and loveliness, to dazzle ambassadors, to represent the splendor of her kingdom. Poets sang of her eyes, chroniclers described her radiance, painters attempted to capture the delicate glow of her skin with the limited colors their palettes could offer. But beauty, when left unguarded, was treacherous. It could inspire devotion, but also envy. It could draw admirers, but also accusations. A queen whose beauty stirred too much attention became a subject of suspicion. Was she too vain? Was she manipulating courtiers with a smile? Was her influence over the king merely the result of her appearance? The court would not say it aloud, of course. The punishments for beauty were never declared with fanfare. They unfolded slowly, like a change in season, like the creeping chill of autumn air through a castle's drafty corridor. One day, the queen might notice that her compliments were tinged with caution. "You are as lovely as ever, your majesty," though such brilliance must be blinding at times. A harmless jest on the surface. But beneath it, a seed. In a court where power was a careful balancing act, a queen's beauty was not allowed to exist simply for her own enjoyment. It had to serve a purpose, to be measured, restrained, to appear as a gift bestowed upon her by God, not something she tended with intention. She's too concerned with mirrors and jewels. She distracts the king from serious matters. And so beauty, once a gift, became a quiet liability. The queen knew this. She had been taught from a young age how to manage her image, how to accept admiration without seeming to seek it, how to wear fine gowns without appearing vain. Yet, it was never enough. There were always eyes watching. A queen who smiled too warmly at a visiting noble might be accused of flirtation. One who wore a particularly dazzling necklace to a court function might be suspected of flaunting her influence. Even the simplest act of brushing her hair before an open window could invite stories of seduction, of secret intentions. The court loved a beautiful queen, but only when she remained perfectly still, an icon, a symbol, untouchable, the moment. She seemed to enjoy her beauty for herself. The tone shifted. There are countless stories of queens whose reputations suffered beneath this delicate trap. Queens who were adored in their youth, only to be quietly resented as their beauty matured into influence. Queens who found their admirers' praises turning into veiled critiques. "Beauty fades," they would whisper. She should turn her thoughts to piety. It was a subtle erasure, not a fall from grace, but a slow withdrawal of admiration. And yet, beauty was not something a queen could shed. She could dress modestly, avoid ornate hairstyles, refrain from lavish jewelry, but even then, her natural grace was enough to provoke discomfort. Her beauty became a canvas upon which others projected their fears and desires. If a political alliance faltered, if a noble's favor wavered, there would always be those who hinted that the queen's charm had turned manipulative, that her loveliness was a mask for secret ambitions. It was easier to suspect her smile than to question the king's decisions. Even her own ladies-in-waiting, companions who shared her chambers and routines, were caught in this quiet web. Their compliments grew guarded, their glances measured. A queen who enjoyed her reflection too much could find herself isolated, her beauty transforming from a shared source of pride into a solitary burden. And yet, amidst this careful choreography of appearances, there were small rebellions. A queen might choose to wear a silk gown in a shade that shimmered just a little too brightly. She might arrange her hair in a way that caught the sunlight when she entered the hall. These were subtle acts, invisible to the scribes and historians, but deeply felt within the court. They were acts of quiet defiance. For beneath the layers of brocade and velvet, beneath the veil of royal duty, there was still a woman who wished to take pleasure in her own reflection, not for the court, not for the king, but for herself. Yet, the risks remain dot and dot in some courts. The accusation of vanity could escalate into more dangerous territories. A queen whose beauty unsettled too many powerful men could find herself the subject of darker rumors. Was her allure unnatural? Did she possess charms beyond the ordinary? Whispers of enchantments, of secret potions, of witchcraft, these were not uncommon. It did not take much for a queen's beauty to be recast as evidence of sorcery. A glance, a gesture, a smile, these could be reinterpreted through the distorted lens of fear and suspicion. And so, the queen learned to navigate this fragile space. She cultivated a beauty that was always restrained, always justified, a jeweled pin, but paired with a modest neckline, a silk sash, but in subdued hues, a carefully measured smile warm, but never lingering dot in the privacy of her chambers. However, the rules could be forgotten dot there, before her silver mirror. She could run her fingers through her hair without caution, trace the line of her cheekbone without fear of judgment. She could enjoy the sensation of silk against her skin, the gleam of pearls resting against her collarbone. These were moments of pure, unpunished pleasure. The court did not see them, but she knew they existed, even as the scribes inked their cautious praises, even as courtiers rehearsed their measured compliments. The queen carried within her a quiet knowledge that her beauty was hers alone. Beyond their interpretations, she understood that admiration from the court was conditional, fleeting. But self-admiration, however small, was an enduring refuge. There were queens who chose to immortalize this quiet confidence. They commissioned portraits, not the grand public displays, but small, intimate paintings meant for private chambers. In these, their expressions were softer, more candid, free from the rigid expectations of courtly decorum. A secret smile, a relaxed pose, a direct gaze, these images captured the versions of themselves that the court was never allowed to see. These portraits were acts of silent reclamation for in a world where their beauty was constantly defined by others. These women found subtle ways to define it for themselves. Yet, as history moved forward, the same cycle repeated. The court would continue to celebrate a queen's beauty when it served their image, and quietly weaponize it when her presence grew too bold, too joyful, too independent. And so, beneath the shimmering pearls and flowing silks, beneath the carefully arranged hairstyles and measured glances, the queen carried a quiet truth. Her beauty was not a sin, but the world preferred to treat it as one. Soon, even the pleasures of fashion itself, the fabrics, the jewels, the quiet choices made in the sanctuary of her wardrobe would become battlegrounds of judgment, where every hemline and embroidery would be scrutinized, weighed, and silently punished. But that is a reflection for another night. The parchment before him is smooth, pale, waiting. His task today is simple: to continue the chronicle of a reign, to ink the deeds of kings, the shifting borders of realms, the treaties and triumphs that shape the visible world. His lines are steady, precise. His letters form arches and loops with a beauty that will last for centuries. But there is a silence beneath his words, a queen's laughter. Never recorded, a princess's counsel, never acknowledged. A noblewoman's defiance, never preserved. The slow erasure of royal women from history was not an event, it was a process. A quiet, bureaucratic fading. Their names, their thoughts, their joys and sorrows, carefully omitted, as if the scroll itself could not bear the weight of their presence. Yet, they had been there. They had walked the cold stone corridors, their footsteps muffled by velvet slippers. They had sat beside kings in council chambers, their hands folded, their words measured. They had exchanged letters, whispered advice, steered decisions not with declarations, but with glances and silences. But the scribes, bound by their own rules of significance, saw fit to leave them out. Not entirely, of course. Their names appeared, when necessary, upon marriage treaties, in records of childbirths, and the margins of coronation lists. A queen was recorded when she produced an heir. A princess was named when her marriage secured an alliance. But beyond these official notations, their stories blurred into the background. Their pleasures, their sufferings, their quiet rebellions, these were deemed irrelevant to the narrative of kings and conquests in the long halls of medieval chronicles. A queen's life was often reduced to a footnote. Her influence, when recognized, was reframed. If a policy succeeded, it was the king's. Wisdom, if it failed, murmurs suggested the queen's vanity or indulgence had been to blame. The invisible work of persuasion, of emotional labor, of delicate negotiation, faded from the inked lines, but their absence from the records did not mean they were absent from power. The erasure was deliberate. History was crafted as much by what was left out as by what was included. A queen who mediated disputes between noble families, whose empathy prevented bloodshed, might never appear in a chronicle. A princess whose quiet diplomacy softened the ambitions of rival courts could be entirely omitted. Their contributions were often considered unofficial, domestic, private, feminine, and thus undeserving of parchment. And so, with each passing generation, their stories faded. A new scribe, tasked with copying old manuscripts, might glance over a queen's marginal note and decide it was not essential. A historian, compiling a lineage of rulers, might skip over a regency held briefly by a dowager queen, dismissing her governance as temporary, unworthy of detailed mention. Even their portraits, once displayed in galleries, found themselves relegated to storage rooms, paint cracked, names forgotten. It was a slow erosion, not an act of violence, but of neglect. And yet, amidst this quiet erasure, traces remained in the folds of illuminated manuscripts. Delicate symbols hinted at their presence. A flower drawn beside a queen's name. A miniature portrait hidden in a decorative initial. In personal letters preserved only by chance, queens confided their frustrations, their hopes, their quiet triumphs, but these were whispers, not declarations. The official chronicles marched forward, recounting battles and treaties, while the daily realities of royal women, complex, vibrant, often painful, remained confined to private journals, overlooked correspondence, and oral traditions that faded with time. Consider the countless royal women whose names we no longer speak. They lived in gilded chambers, their gowns heavy with embroidery, their thoughts sharp beneath veils of etiquette. They navigated courts filled with ambition, balancing loyalty and self-preservation with a grace that went unrecorded. Their pleasures, whether found in music, in gardens, in books, were private and fleeting because history did not deem them worthy of preservation. Even queens who dared to step beyond their expected roles found their legacies rewritten. A queen who ruled as regent might later be remembered as overstepping, her achievements downplayed, her motivations questioned. A noblewoman who funded artistic endeavors might be remembered only as a patron's wife, her vision attributed to others. And when a woman's influence became too undeniable to ignore, history often reshaped her into a cautionary tale. She was ambitious. She was vain. The language softened their achievements into something suspect, their leadership into an anomaly, their joy into an excess. It was safer, history seemed to suggest, to remember royal women as passive figures, beautiful and silent. But even as the official records narrowed their presence, these women found ways to inscribe themselves into memory. Some commissioned works of art that subtly bore their likenesses. Others embedded their names into the foundations of churches, into the margins of charitable deeds. Their identities survived, not in grand proclamations, but in the quiet persistence of their choices. A queen might be remembered in the dedication of a manuscript, her initials entwined with floral motifs. A princess's influence might echo in the songs of a troubadour, disguised beneath layers of allegory. These fragments, scattered and often overlooked, became the threads of a hidden tapestry, a parallel history that refused to vanish entirely. And, in some cases, centuries later, scholars and historians would begin to notice these threads, piecing together letters, annotations, and neglected records. They would start to reconstruct the stories long buried beneath the weight of official history. A queen's council rediscovered in a diplomat's private journal. A noblewoman's poetry, once dismissed, now seen as a rare glimpse into her inner life. The process of erasure was slow. But so too is the process of recovery. Even now, there are stories yet to be uncovered, names waiting to be remembered. And in reflecting upon this, we see that the quiet erasure of royal women was never complete. Their lives persisted not in the loud, official annals of power, but in the soft, resilient echoes of art, of letters, of whispered family legends passed from mother to daughter. Their absence in the records is not a silence of their making it is a silence imposed upon them. But beneath that silence, their lives unfolded with complexity, with joy, with sorrow, with quiet acts of resistance that history could not fully erase. And so, in the stillness of the scriptorium, as the scribe dips his quill and continues his chronicle of kings and conquests, the stories of queens linger quietly in the margins. Waiting to be seen, waiting to be read anew, but even beyond the erasure of their stories, royal women faced another quiet battlefield. Their very clothing, their fashion choices, became a source of subtle judgment, where every stitch and gem could provoke scrutiny. That is a reflection for another night around her. The quiet ballet of dressing begins. Hands lift silks from cedar chests. Brocade gowns are unfolded with reverence. Jewels glint softly as they catch the first breath of daylight. The air is filled with the subtle fragrance of lavender sachets, hidden among the linens to protect them from time's quiet decay. But this is no simple ritual of adornment. Every choice is a calculation. For in the medieval court, a queen's gown was never just fabric. It was a statement, a negotiation, a silent battleground where beauty, propriety, power, and suspicion collided. The queen knows this as the maidens lace her corset, not too tightly, not too loosely. She knows it as her fingers linger over a string of pearls, deciding whether their soft glow speaks of elegance or excess. She knows it as she considers the length of her train, the richness of her embroidery, the shimmer of gold thread that weaves through her sleeves. Every fold, every hem, every jewel holds a weight beyond its own. The court watches. The whispers begin before she even enters. The Great Hall. Did you see the queen's new velvet cloak? How extravagant in such difficult times. Her gown was embroidered in gold, perhaps a little too lavish for a pious woman. She dresses to dazzle, not to serve. It is a delicate line to walk. A queen is expected to embody the grandeur of her kingdom, to reflect the prosperity and dignity of her court. Yet, should her appearance draw too much attention, should her enjoyment of finery become visible, it transforms into a quiet transgression. Pleasure, in the form of fashion, becomes an indulgence that demands correction, and yet the queen cannot abstain entirely. A queen who dresses too simply risks accusations of disrespect, of undermining her royal station. Simplicity is not her luxury. The court expects splendor, but only in the correct measure, only when adorned with the veil of humility. The queen's wardrobe is thus a constant balancing act. Her gowns are designed not only for beauty, but for survival. A dress in a shade too bold might suggest vanity. A necklace too opulent might provoke murmurs of greed. The court's expectations are fluid, shifting like the tides, and the queen is left to navigate them with each silk ribbon and silver clasp. There are moments in the privacy of her chambers when she allows herself to savor the simple pleasure of fabric beneath her fingertips, the cool weight of a sapphire pendant resting against her collarbone, the intricate patterns of lace that took months of quiet labor to create. These are fleeting joys. She knows that once she steps beyond these walls, these same adornments will cease to be her own. They will be dissected by the eyes of courtiers, weighed against unspoken standards, turned into symbols of indulgence or impropriety, even gifts, garments sent by foreign rulers. Jewels bestowed in celebration come wrapped in invisible expectations. To accept them too eagerly is to appear greedy. To refuse them is to risk offense. A queen's relationship with her wardrobe is a constant diplomacy. Every brooch and bracelet, a potential message. And yet, despite the scrutiny, fashion remains. One of the few realms where a queen can express herself, her choice of colors, of patterns, of textures, though constrained by etiquette, offer subtle hints of her mood. Her preferences, her quiet defiance, a queen might choose to wear a gown. Embroidered with motifs from her homeland, a silent assertion of her origins in a foreign court. She might favor certain fabrics not for their cost, but for the memories they hold, the way a particular velvet drapes over her shoulders, the way a silk sash reminds her of childhood ceremonies. But the price of these pleasures is constant vigilance. For courtiers, especially those who resent a queen's influence, are quick to transform fashion into a weapon of criticism. A queen who wears jewels during a season of poor harvests is seen as heartless. One who favors foreign silks might be accused of disloyalty. Even a change in hairstyle can provoke quiet questions about her modesty, her character. The scrutiny is relentless, yet never overt. No decrees are issued. No formal accusations made. The punishment unfolds in whispers. An ambassador's report noting her inclination towards vanity. A bishop's sermon subtly chastising the excesses of courtly women. A poem circulated among nobles, thinly veiled in allegory, mocking a queen's indulgence in adornments. These are the silent punishments for enjoying pleasure in a visible form. There is no trial, no confrontation, only a growing discomfort, a subtle erosion of respect, a quiet tightening of expectations. The queen, however, is not unaware of these currents. She learns to armor herself not with jewels, but with composure. Her wardrobe becomes a language of balance, luxurious, but never ostentatious. She crafts her image carefully, ensuring that her elegance is always framed within the bounds of dignity. Her pleasures hidden beneath layers of duty got yet. The act of dressing remains a form of quiet rebellion. With each gown chosen, each accessory placed, the queen reclaims a small fragment of agency. In a world where her words are measured and her actions monitored, the choice of a velvet ribbon, the placement of a jeweled pin, becomes an assertion of self. There are moments when she dares to bend the rules. A gown with embroidery that catches the candlelight just a little too brilliantly. A pair of shoes crafted in a style from her childhood, evoking memories the court cannot decipher. A subtle perfume that lingers in the air longer than expected. These are her silent joys. No proclamation accompanies them. No explanation is offered, but their existence in itself is a form of resistance. For in a court that sought to control even the threads of her garments, the queen found ways to express her pleasures not loudly, but persistently. Still, the weight of judgment remains. She feels it in the lingering glances as she enters a feast. She hears it in the careful tones of courtiers commenting on her attire. She senses it in the shifting posture of nobles who see in her beauty, her adornments, a challenge to their comfort. The price of indulgence is constant negotiation. And yet, amidst these silent battles, the queen's wardrobe tells a story that the chronicles overlook. A story of careful choices, of pleasures taken in fleeting moments, of identity expressed in silk and satin where words could not safely tread. History would later describe her simply, she was known for her elegance. But within those words lies a hidden narrative of a woman who navigated suspicion and expectation, who crafted beauty not just for the court's gaze, but for her own quiet reflection. A woman who, beneath the weight of embroidered gowns and jeweled crowns, found small sanctuaries of joy. And as the queen stands before her mirror, adjusting a simple clasp with deliberate care, she knows that her pleasures, though scrutinized, though judged, are still hers. But beyond the court's silent critiques of fashion, another quiet burden awaits. For even in the most intimate joys of motherhood, royal women found their personal desires overshadowed by duty. Their bodies turned into vessels for dynasties. Their joys replaced by expectations. In the queen's private chamber, the air feels hushed, as if the very walls are holding their breath. A cradle stands by the window, its delicate canopy swaying gently in a breeze that carries the faint scent of the palace gardens. Embroidered blankets are folded with precision, tiny garments of fine linen await, untouched. But there's no child yet, only the waiting. For a queen, motherhood was never simply a personal joy, it was a duty, a responsibility. A task she was born to fulfill, expected to execute with grace, regardless of the personal toll. From the moment a royal marriage was sealed, the expectation of heirs loomed over every gesture, every glance. Courtiers watched for signs, a lingering. Hand upon the abdomen, a pale complexion, a refusal of wine. Whispers circulated with every delay, with every passing month of silence. The pressure was not loud, but it was relentless. Dot and letters exchanged between kings and ambassadors, a queen's. Worth was often measured in future heirs and the possibility of strong sons. The court's gaze followed her into every hall, every chapel, their hopes and suspicions intertwining until her body became not her own, but a vessel for dynasties, even in the privacy of her own thoughts. The queen felt the weight of this expectation. Pregnancy, when it came, was greeted with fanfare, but also with scrutiny. Every movement was watched. Every craving, every moment of fatigue became a subject of speculation. The queen's body, once adorned for beauty, was now a subject of political importance. She bore this silently. There was no space for personal longing, no room for vulnerability. The joys of impending motherhood, the soft flutter of life within. The secret wonder of carrying a future were overshadowed by the court's constant hunger for heirs, and it was not enough to bear a child. It had to be a son. The walls of the royal nursery were lined with tapestries depicting kings of old, warriors, and rulers, their eyes cold and expectant. The cradle, though ornate, felt like a stage awaiting a performance. The queen, even in her most intimate moments, was performing a role written long before her birth. Should the child be a daughter, the disappointment would be palpable. Courtiers would offer polite smiles, but their eyes would search for signs of the next pregnancy, the next attempt. The queen's body would be summoned once more into duty, her own desires secondary to the demands of lineage. Even in success, the victory was never truly hers. A son would be celebrated as the king's heir, the kingdom's future. The queen's labor, her pain, her endurance, these would be folded into formal announcements. Her personal triumph diluted into public ceremony, in the quiet hours of the night. As she rocked her newborn in the soft glow of candlelight, the queen found a bittersweet solitude. The world outside these walls saw only the air. But here, in this moment, she allowed herself to see the child, not as a future king, but as her own, a small, breathing life that fit within her arms, that knew nothing of crowns or alliances. But even this fleeting peace was interrupted by duty. Nurses, midwives, and advisors hovered nearby, ready to shape the child's first days. The queen, though a mother, was not always permitted to be one fully. The upbringing of heirs was a matter of state. Wet nurses were assigned, tutors selected, rituals enforced. The queen's role was ceremonial, her touch was for presentation. Her lullabies, though softly sung, were not the official songs of succession. Even her presence in the nursery was sometimes seen as indulgent, a distraction from her obligations as queen. In time, as the child grew, the queen's influence diminished. A son was molded by men, by councils and tutors. A daughter was prepared. For the same path, the queen had walked a marriage of alliances, a life of expectations. And so, the cycle continued. Motherhood, rather than a space of personal joy, became another extension of duty. The queen's body had been borrowed for lineage. Her heart was now expected to relinquish its claims in favor of political necessity. Yet, amidst these expectations, royal women carved out moments of quiet connection. A soft kiss placed upon a sleeping child's forehead before the nurse arrived. A lullaby hummed beneath the sound of courtly discussions. A fleeting glance exchanged during public ceremonies, where mother and child remembered, if only briefly, the bond that stretched beyond crowns and treaties. Some queens resisted, in subtle, Ways dot they insisted upon personally teaching their daughters how to read, sharing stories not found in official chronicles. They planted small gardens where their children could play away from the rigid gaze of court. They wove personal tokens into their children's garments, a hidden stitch, a protective charm, a whispered blessing. These acts went unnoticed by the scribes who chronicled royal lineages, but they mattered. They were acts of quiet defiance. Moments where personal joy slipped through the cracks of expectation. Still, the court's demands never ceased. With every new heir, the cycle renewed itself. The queen's worth was reassessed, her successes measured in the health, gender, and future alliances of her offspring. Her own well-being, her own desires, faded into the background. The physical toll of repeated pregnancies, the emotional weight of losses, these were borne in silence. There were no public acknowledgments of a queen's suffering. No scribe recorded the nights she spent weeping for a stillborn child, or the fear that gripped her before each labor. Her endurance was assumed. Her sacrifices expected. Yet, within the cold stone walls of royal nurseries, stories unfolded that defied the formal scripts. A queen teaching her son to listen, not just to command. A mother sharing songs of her homeland with a daughter destined for a foreign court. In these small, tender moments, the queen reclaimed fragments of motherhood for herself, not as a duty, not as a royal obligation, but as a quiet, human connection that existed beyond the reach of politics. History, in its official records, may have overlooked these stories, but they linger in the soft lullabies that echo through forgotten chambers in the faded stitches of heirlooms passed down quietly through generations. Motherhood for royal women was rarely allowed to be a source of unfiltered joy. It was a path paved with expectations, monitored by courtiers, shaped by the needs of kingdoms. But within that narrow path, queens found ways to nurture, to love, to connect, if only in whispers, if only in fleeting, fragile moments. And beyond the duties of motherhood, royal women faced yet another realm where their affections were scrutinized. Even friendships, the simple act of emotional companionship, were seen through a lens of suspicion and political intrigue. The great halls of medieval palaces often echoed with silence far louder than any trumpet's call. Beneath painted ceilings and within walls draped in tapestries, quiet judgments were passed not with proclamations, but with glances, with murmurs, with the soft rustle of parchment as accusations were written in careful, deliberate hands. In such a world, a queen's pleasures, her laughter, her beauty, her friendships were fragile things, adored in public, but dangerous in private. As long as a queen's charm served the interests of the court, it was celebrated. Her grace, her elegance, her presence at tournaments and feasts, these were paraded as symbols of a thriving kingdom. But when the winds of power shifted, and when kings faltered or factions turned restless, the very qualities that once adorned a queen became the threads from which her downfall was woven. It was a quiet, familiar pattern. When a king failed in war, when taxes grew burdensome, or when alliances crumbled, the blame could not always be voiced openly against him. The king, after all, was sovereign, untouchable. But a queen, she was within reach. She was visible. She was most dangerously beloved. And so, admiration could swiftly be recast as seduction. A queen who dressed too finely, who smiled too often, who gathered admirers in the garden or at court, was vulnerable to whispers of manipulation. Her influence over the king became suspect. Her pleasures, once charming, were painted as distractions. If a king was seen as weak, it was easy to suggest that a queen's indulgences had dulled his. Resolved. All without raising a voice. It began with quiet questions in council chambers. Casual remarks about the queen's spending, her entourage, the frequency of her appearances at courtly entertainments. These seeds, once planted, blossomed into rumors that spread softly. Like the trailing ivy on stone walls. She was too visible. Too joyful. Too present in matters that should belong to men. Sometimes the accusations took on darker tones. Throughout history, Queens who stood out, who drew too much admiration, who refused to fade into the background, were met with more than just social disapproval. They became targets of slander that dripped with fear and superstition. A queen who enjoyed the company of poets, who hosted lively salons of artists and philosophers, might suddenly be accused of using charms or potions to bend minds. A queen, known for her beauty, who dared to maintain her appearance even in mourning, could find herself whispered about as a seductress, a sorceress, an enchantress whose vanity endangered the realm. The accusations rarely came as public confrontations. They were quiet, bureaucratic punishments, a withdrawal of invitations, a reassignment of trusted ladies in waiting, a subtle exclusion from council meetings or ceremonial duties. A queen could find herself slowly isolated, her once admiring court thinning into a cautious silence in some cases. The charges escalated to formal trials, but even these were draped in the language of respectability. The accusations would be phrased delicately. Improper influence, misuse of royal privileges, undue frivolity. Beneath the surface, however, the message was clear. The queen was guilty of enjoying her life too visibly, of being too human in a role that demanded silent perfection. There were queens whose pleasures were rebranded as treason. Accusations of adultery, whether true or not, became tools to discredit a queen whose popularity posed a threat to political factions. Court poets who once sang her praises might be summoned to testify against her. Jewelry gifted in affection could be listed as evidence of bribery or seduction. Every act of personal joy was turned against her, piece by piece. It was not always about actual guilt. It was about making her seem too much. Too much beauty, too much wit, too much presence. And so the court quietly dismantled the image it had once built. Queen who laughed too freely at a feast could find her laughter. Described as a mockery of the crown, a queen who dressed magnificently could be accused of draining the treasury. A queen who held private audiences might be painted as a schemer. Punishments followed patterns of elegant cruelty. She might not be thrown into a dungeon, but into exile within her own palace restricted. To distant chambers, her movements monitored, her guests carefully selected. Her name might remain in official ceremonies, but her voice would no longer be heard. Some queens were sent to convents under the guise of piety. Others were placed under house arrest. Their letters censored, their companions chosen by their accusers. Few, less fortunate, met darker fates, public trials on charges of witchcraft or adultery, spectacles designed not to seek justice, but to satisfy the court's need to purge her presence. Yet, it was rarely a single explosive event. More often, it was a slow erosion. Invisible trial where the queen's pleasure itself was the crime, and the punishment was her quiet removal from the tapestry of public life. Her portraits were turned to the walls. Her name ceased to appear in proclamations. Her laughter, once echoed in ballads, became a forbidden memory. But even in these moments of silent condemnation, royal women found ways to resist. Some queens responded with dignified silence, maintaining their poise as their roles were stripped away. Others used their forced solitude to write memoirs, letters, reflections that carried their voices beyond the reach of their accusers. There were queens who, despite their isolation, became symbols of quiet defiance. Their presence lingered in the gardens they once tended, in the libraries where they had gathered books, in the small chapels where they continued to sing hymns softly, defiantly. For while the court could remove a queen from its stage, it could not erase the echoes of her joys. And history, though it may have tried to forget them, still holds these women in its silent corners, the queens whose pleasures became treason, whose laughter was turned into accusation, yet who endured beneath the weight of courtly silence. But this is not where their stories end. For beyond the punishments and the erasures, there remained a quieter, deeper truth. Royal women found ways to reclaim joy. In gardens and books and secret songs, they carved out moments of quiet resistance, moments that, though unseen by the chroniclers, were victories nonetheless.